Please be joined on the Chris Flintoff show by Kit Klarenberg. How you doing, Kit?
Very well, thanks. How you doing?
I'm good. Now, this week we've had the story of Donald Trump on the phone to Putin, sorting out Ukraine, effectively. This has been pretty massive in terms of what's been going on. Every hour there's stuff coming out, isn't there? I mean, this is on Friday morning. Probably by Sunday, this will all be out of date.
The pace of events currently is, I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, and I think that the Trump administration, this is a deliberate strategy of the Trump administration, is to make a ton of bold moves in a blitzkrieg, therefore leaving your opponents reeling and scrambling to try and find some response to what you're doing. The administration's moves in various regards do seem like deeply serious in terms of achieving stated objectives. First and foremost, ending the Ukraine proxy war. Trump and Putin recently spoke ahead of a Munich security summit, which the BBC has claimed could see the old world order crumble. Trump and Putin spoke for 90 minutes on the phone, and then subsequently Trump had a 10-minute follow-up conversation with Zelensky, where he was probably, the Ukrainian president was probably told, well, we're going ahead with this whether you like it or not, or without you or without your involvement or not. And since then, Trump has signaled a willingness to enter direct talks with the Russians, perhaps via Saudi Arabia. To quote the title of a very good Julian Barnes novel, there is a sense of an ending in the air. To say the least, the Europeans, in particular the British, are deeply unhappy about this, but the question of how they can respond, and if they can do anything at all to prevent this nightmare ending is a very open one.
So I'm just going to play something that was on Newsnight that you pointed out to me as one reaction to what's been happening.
What I'm hearing are things like this. They, the US administration, are doing this above Zelensky's head. And on the overall approach, which is that no way will Vladimir Putin get all he wants, which is Ukraine, but Vladimir Zelensky will lose a huge amount of Ukraine. This is what I'm hearing of the US administration. The bastards are going to do this.
And that's talking about the Trump administration right now.
That is talking.
They are the bastards.
That is what people in the UK defence establishment are saying.
What we're seeing here is this is called you're saying it's a proxy war, and most people are saying that as well. Zelensky, they're making out that he's autonomous, that he's independent of US influence or control. That's what that little interview is about. How is this coming out that they can sort of make out that Zelensky's nothing to do with the US, or he's got to be speaking to Zelensky? It's a very strange development.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the way that Trump hammered out the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was to completely sideline the puppet government in Kabul, which had zero influence or credibility or legitimacy whatsoever. And he spoke to the Taliban directly. So, I mean, bearing in mind that Ukraine is wholly dependent on Western financial support to quite literally keep its lights on, most of what remains of Ukraine's state institutions, like the government and the police, all of their salaries were being paid by the US. That they have zero political or economic dependence whatsoever at this point. If the US was to pull its support, I think that they would have a few days left in the running. There has been a lot of talk and a lot of yapping from EU officials, and particularly the British, because I would argue that they have been the key driving force in pushing for this proxy war, and believed and wanted it to expand into a all-out hot war, were between the West and Russia that would eventually be won by the West, and therefore opening up Russia to balkanization, breaking up into easily manageable and exploitable chunks, so its vast resources can line the pockets of Western oligarchs. But it's very clear that that was never the US strategy. They were, I mean, for all of the idiocy and delusions within the US imperial brain trust, there is still, enough people with enough smarts to understand that all-out war with Russia would be very bad and almost inevitably end in, nuclear strikes, which, would wipe out the entire world. It is notable that the most hawkish voices on Ukraine are coming from countries that are either indescribably tiny, like like the Baltic states, which have populations of a few million, and they have virtually no militaries to speak of. Britain is currently undergoing a defense review, and already there are elements of its military force that are being scrapped and sold off. There is open debate as to whether Britain's 2 aircraft carriers, which were 20 years in the making effectively and cost billions, and have proven completely useless, white elephants, there is now open talk about them being scrapped or sold off. There was a House of Lords report released last summer, which it got zero media traction, but it was repeatedly made the point over and over again that Britain has no meaningful military whatsoever. Its standing army, in terms of deployable troop frontline soldiers, wouldn't fill Wembley Stadium. Britain has a bunch of very expensive and difficult to maintain status symbols like Trident, which is a hostage to American goodwill. It's not an independent nuclear deterrent, and Britain has. There have been reports that the British Army has sought to fix problems within Trident using super glue. Which is not particularly encouraging. If you look at the casualty figures that are emerging on a daily basis in Ukraine, Britain would last a few weeks in direct confrontation with Russia. Yet they seem utterly determined to keep this going. Keir Starmer, of course, has repeatedly pledged to keep sending billions annually to Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is despite ever collapsing living standards at home, almost permanent state of recession, inflation continuing to ratchet, and the pound's value in international markets drooping. There is a lot of talk about boosting European defence spending. Well, Europe doesn't have the industrial base to support an expansion of its military strength. It doesn't have the factories and the know-how to pump out vast quantities of artillery shells on a regular basis. Russia can make 1.5 million per month. It can't make tanks on any scale. There's a great phrase which is, you can print money, but you can't print bullets or people. The top line pledges of the EU and Britain to carry on supporting this financially may not actually translate into anything meaningful on the ground.
I just wanted to show you another clip that I find interesting. It's the response of some people who some would say were on the left. Is not there's a lot of argument and division on the left about what's going on in Ukraine. This is George Monbiot on Question Time last night. I'm just going to share this one.
There are Chamberlains in every generation.
Oh, here we go.
And this is appeasement. This is direct appeasement of an aggressor, of someone who... Just a moment. This is direct appeasement of someone who has moved into a sovereign country, seized its territory, sought to seize the entire country, and it's as if, he'd come to the UK, he'd occupied Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and then somebody else like Donald Trump comes along and says, yeah, fine, guys, just live with that, no trouble at all. These people who go on and on about sovereignty, say they're the defenders of sovereignty. When it actually comes to the crunch, they will sell anyone down the river.
So, George, sorry, you haven't answered my question. berating everybody as Chamberlains. How do you solve the war in Ukraine? What's your solution?
We have to help Ukraine
Just keep
defend
going.
itself.
Just keep going.
Yes, that's what
13
Ukraine
billion
wants to do.
for 13 billion
This is what Ukraine wants to do. Ukraine does not want to surrender on Trump's terms. It is up to Ukraine.
So there you go.
And anyone who cares for a democratic world order, anyone who cares about stopping aggression and expansionism, should side with Ukraine trying to defend its sovereign territory.
It's sort of incredible that Monbiot's attacking this guy. I don't know, some sort of right-wing commentator. I don't know who he is, but using this sort of appeasement line, and also this sort of not taking into account the fact that the US has been funding this war. I mean, it's very strange, isn't it? How do you explain Monbiot's perspective on this?
Well, I mean, George Monbiot is, I mean, I'm not sure if he's been got to or something, but I mean, this was someone who, during the wars, the US proxy wars in the Balkans, and during the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, was publishing regular op-eds in The Guardian about the energy interests that were integral to these conflicts and the wider geopolitical benefits that Western powers were seeking by fomenting and executing them. He seems to have done a total volte-face around the time of the Syrian dirty war and become a rabid tub thumper for getting rid of Assad via force and attacking anyone questioning mainstream narratives on what was happening in Syria and why. Quite bizarrely, I mean, it's what's interesting about that clip is that he engages in all sorts of tub thumping, lofty rhetoric, but then when that author, the bald individual who was quite rightly questioning what would you do, he doesn't actually really have much of an answer. Oh, well, Ukraine doesn't want those terms. Well, actually, if you look at polls, including in the western parts of Ukraine where Ukrainian nationalism is strongest, and enmity towards Russia has historically been highest, there is not majority support for keeping this going. People want this over. There are attacks on there are an enormous number of deeply upsetting videos of conscription squads, press ganging, violent and often quite violently, young men off the streets in Ukraine. In some cases, I've seen some videos of people who have amputations, that they have, they're missing an arm or a leg, and they get conscripted because they were meant to return to the front line and blah blah. I mean, it's really quite repulsive. But there is a growing public sentiment against the war in Ukraine. If you look at polls, even since the start of this, there has been a significant proportion of Ukrainians who blame their own government for starting this, which is a quite reasonable position to take, because successive administrations in Ukraine refused to implement the Minsk Accords that were brokered in 2014, which called for autonomy for the Donbass within Ukraine. And they just stonewalled, and Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, who helped broker them, have since admitted that actually they were just a delaying tactic to allow Ukraine to arm themselves. Now, admissions like that mean that Putin is, and the Russian government more widely, are not going to be particularly trusting of Western pledges and promises, and they're particularly not going to be willing to engage with someone like Zelensky. I strongly suspect that Zelensky probably only has a few weeks or months left at the absolute most at this rate. I think Trump has openly stated if there was an election now, he'd lose it. The prospect of a palace coup grows every day. Already, there are, and this has been reported in the mainstream media, there are entire cities and towns and villages in Ukraine that don't have male populations because they've all been killed, or they are in hiding from conscription, or they've fled conscription. Yeah, like average Ukrainians don't want to keep this going, contrary to what Monbiot is saying. Yes, it is quite a common thing when British leaders want to justify aggressive proxy wars or belligerent actions abroad, that comparisons with the appeasement of the Nazis, or referencing America's alleged failure to meet its duties to uphold freedom and democracy overseas. Of course, the US has never been about that in any meaningful way whatsoever, and they have a long and extensive history of throwing their proxies under the bus when it suits them. I mean, I think the real reason they're angry is they understand that without American backing and support for this, it can't go on any further. It is rather forgotten that in the British were seemingly kept out of the loop on the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. There was an official parliamentary report which stated that, yes, British officials had no idea about that this war absolutely was going to be a full and permanent pullout. Now, it's rather forgotten that in the days immediately following this, in September 2021, there were some British pundits and politicians who stated, well, if the US is leaving, Britain can reconstitute a new international coalition to keep Afghanistan free, quote unquote, and prevent the Taliban taking power. That lasted about a day before reality kicked in. As I say, despite the very inflammatory, belligerent, and I would say deeply problematic rhetoric that is emanating from a lot of European capitals, a lot of Western journalists, a lot of Kiev ultras about the prospect of the US pullout, I think it might shock people how quickly this has all moved on and forgotten about once a deal is signed. I'm sure that Britain will be taking covert and overt efforts to try and sabotage this. This will be allowed to continue for as long as the US wants or needs it to, and it seems to have gotten to the point that they don't want it to carry on anymore. And I might add as well that on top of Europe being unable to keep this going, last July there was a RAND report which I've written about for my website, kitklerenberg.com, shameless plug, sorry about that. There was a RAND report which basically stated, the RAND being this Pentagon think tank, it openly and repeatedly made the point over and over again that the US does not currently have the defense industrial base to maintain the quote unquote extraordinary munitions requirements of Ukraine and also the Gaza genocide. They are unable to keep those conflicts, those proxy conflicts going, and they lack the industrial base to replenish stockpiles of what's been sent. The report called for effective reindustrialization of the US, which is a tricky task indeed, and might take decades to overcome this. So again, I think that whatever the malign fantasies of people within Whitehall and Kiev, when the US steps away from this, it's over. Do
you think a lot of this is it's a bit like that? There's those stages of grief, aren't there, that you go through?
Denial. Yeah,
that's the first one, isn't it? Denial, and then it sort of moves on a bit. Is that where we are? We're just sort of like people are. It's feelings rather than anything rational. It's more like raw pain and upset.
Yeah, well, I mean, the 5 stages are, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it's like, I think we're switching between, denial and bargaining now, like there was, I think it was at the end of 2023 now, there was, Zelensky gave this very bizarre, rambling interview where he said, well, you've given us all this money, give us more, consider it a loan. We'll do this. We'll give you this if you let us keep this going. I mean, there was, of course, recently talk of Zelensky was offering up Ukraine's rare earth minerals, which are actually in Russian territory now, in Donbass, in return for military support. I mean, it's all very, very, very kind of desperate last days in the Führer bunker type stuff. And I mean, again, I think, as I was just saying, I think there is already a very palpable stab in the back myth. Which is percolating. There is many. I've seen many people make this claim that, oh well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the early 90s under US pressure. Ukraine itself never had any nuclear weapons. There were Soviet nuclear weapons that were posted to Ukraine, which were removed and rehoused in Russia under an internationally agreed framework. But there is this growing narrative of betrayal. I've written about this, but I think that that when the US pullout happens, there will be an enormous amount of blowback. You have a lot of very embittered, probably battle traumatized fighters, both Ukrainian and foreign, who are on the ground in Donbass now, who have ready access to weapons. They have frontline fighting experience, and they're probably going to, flood out into Europe and take revenge on people they perceive to have betrayed them. I mean, as I mentioned on my last appearance, Robert Fico got shot. This is the Slovakian leader. He got shot by a Ukrainian supporter who was angry at the fact that his government had cut off financial support to Ukraine. I mean, in my neck of the woods, in the Balkans, but after the wars of the 90s, there were a large number of examples of people who had, kept grenades or other weapons from the conflict, just, carrying out a mass shooting randomly or blowing themselves up in restaurants and cafes. It's I mean, that's all something that we need to look forward to. And I might add as well that at the start of 2023, I think there was Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, which allegedly oversees the work of the intelligence services, but they kind of admit that they're never told the full story. They don't actually know what these agencies are doing. There was a section in a report it published which noted there is a very high risk of people who have been fighting in a redacted country having made extremist connections and returning to the UK, who represent very, very dire security risks, and there is no formal mechanism in place for dealing with them.